The previous two are already posted on the Rails CE Archives page if anyone in the audience missed those, and we'll post this one in a few days. So I can see your screen, Brian.
Awesome. So today we're talking about IT security for libraries. The part 3 is disaster recovery. The first 2 parts, if you were curious, was about securing our network. So how do we protect things from happening? And then so today would be like the direct opposite of, let's say something did happen, how do we react, and what things can happen to us that we need to react with. Part 2 was about dark web and privacy, and how there's different tools out there that people can utilize to get into our environments. So today we're going to focus a little bit about what a disaster recovery plan looks like. But I'm going to spend most of the time today focusing on things we need to consider when we're looking at how do we prepare, how do we prep, which then all that data that you gather goes into your disaster recovery plan. So it's basically going to be like your Bible of what to do when stuff hits the wall. So the first thing to do whenever you're looking at your environment is to identify threats. And there's a whole sorts of different levels of threats that can affect us. It could be an act of God, so that could be a tornado, flood, fire, thunderstorms, whatever it may be that can impact your environment from an IT perspective. And so if a tornado zips through your building and takes out your servers, what happens? Is your data safe? If flood waters come in and drown out your switches in your network, what happens next? So that's a threat you have to identify. Acts of evil, and that could be your hackers, somebody breaking into your library and stealing something. And the same goes, and these scenarios go for if you're hosting your data somewhere else. So if your data is hosted in another area or by another company, these are still threats you want to identify and address. Usually and typically those threats are addressed by the provider, but you still want to bring them up and make sure you have a plan in place. And then physical damage is someone taking a bat to a server or something. Viruses. The other is active error, and that could be accidental deletions, simple hardware failure, a software glitch, a failed update. So something that's kind of out of your control that happens on your systems. What do you do? And that's a threat, and we need to identify what types of threats those are. And the last piece is loss of services, which can again be caused by any of the above. And services is internet power, heating, cooling, your phone, building in general. If all your windows get broken in because of a storm, you can't necessarily open your space, but it's a threat you need to identify. Can it impact our IT infrastructure? So after you identify your threats, you look at your risks. And those risks are whether you can lose internet, you can lose phone, you can lose power, and how you react. Risk with your data. So what happens if your data gets missing, or your data is lost, or somebody corrupts your data? And the last piece is the systems you own. What happens if a system fails? Now that's a risk. You need to be worried about something like that happening, or a failure. So what do you do? And you list out the types of risks. So if you had a email server, that's a risk because something can happen to it. So it's called a risk matrix. It's a pain in the butt to do, but essentially you do this for every single device on your network, from the firewall to the switches to the servers to an individual workstation. But you classify all workstations as a workstation, and and I'll show you it later. But there's a sheet you go through where you would determine if something happens to this, what happens to the business. Does it impact the business in a major way? Does business come to a halt? And then when you identify those risks, how likely are they to happen? So let's say a hurricane, very unlikely, impossible to happen. So we would put that as impossible. Tornado, if you're not around that, I guess there's a certain area where tornadoes are more likely to occur than others, then you would change how certain that tornado hit will be. If you're in the middle of Tornado Alley, then it could be an almost certain risk. Where it has a catastrophic impact, and so it would be an extreme. You would then use these classifications to determine how much effort you put into mitigating that risk. And I use the word mitigate instead of remove risk because it's near impossible to remove risk 100%. Your job, or your IT professionals or whatnot, job is to decrease the amount of risk so it's a less of an impact, or at least there's more things you can do to kind of bring yourself back to running. Overall, a good recovery plan consists of 4 main topics, which is your monitoring. So monitoring your systems, making sure things are running as they're supposed to, so you can kind of detect before something goes down. The other is recoverable backups and systems. So systems need to have backed up data and recoverable. The other piece is redundancy. So can you add more devices into your network to improve the availability of your hardware or computers or whatnot? Should you have backup devices on in your library just in case if something goes down? How important is a specific server? And the last is testing. And this is probably one of the most important things that we will cover today, is testing to make sure your plan works, making sure that all of your ideas work, all of your monitoring tools work, all of your recovery systems work. You can actually, you know how to do recovery, and you can pull a recovery up. To bring in the point that risks, or we need to also monitor our systems on a frequent basis. And it's very, very important because if we're not monitoring, we're not going to be able to react to a risk. If we're just hoping that our systems will take care of themselves, that's probably not the best plan. So having tools in place, and I'm going to show you some tools today that we can utilize to help prevent things from happening, or at least catch them before they go down. In the big picture, and it was actually, I couldn't find any newer reports of the average cost of a downtime. So there was a report done in 2014 by EMC, which is a hardware vendor for basically like storage devices. Essentially, they did a research study, and for the year, data loss and downtime cost enterprises total $1.7 trillion. So $1.7 trillion was lost in the economy because of downtime. Sure, our library doesn't generate revenue, but there's still a loss of people coming in, of our relevance or whatnot. And so it's very important that we maintain as much uptime as possible. When they do lose, it's quite a lot of data. When we talk about emails, for instance, a loss of an email is huge, and if you lose an entire email server, everybody's email is gone, which quadrupled as you add employees and look at things. They say that most IT professionals aren't very confident in their ability to recover information, and that's kind of scary because there's so many risks, and the perspective is there's so many risks, and it's so hard to tackle all of it. And usually, the more you want to mitigate, the more money you have to spend, and so most people don't like spending money, so it makes it very difficult to ensure uptime. In general, your disaster plan is about ensuring redundancy and recovery. So you have a section about planning and preparation where you do your risk management. We talk about a risk assessment. How would you mitigate those risks, and how do you ensure business continuity? Then the other part of the plan is what to do if a disaster occurs. How do you respond? What do you do to fix it? Who's in charge? Who's the contacts? And how do you restore your data? So today I'm going to start talking about those risks and how we can manage them and how we can kind of mitigate some issues relatively simply. So in terms of services, the internet is a very core component for our day-to-day operations. If we're connecting to a remote site for our ILS, if we're connecting to, if all of our data isn't hosted in our building and it's hosted at another company, then we need to make sure we have internet to connect to that data, because people won't be able to log in if we're not connected to Active Directory unless that person logged in before. And so there's all these scenarios that require our internet to be up and running. In a general network, or maybe like at your home, your setup is your ISP, or internet service provider, going into a modem, and then your device is connecting to the modem or a switch or a router. In our corporate environment, it's modem, firewall, switches, and then devices, usually. We can decrease the impact of an internet outage by having 2 internet service providers. and you would pick 2 different internet service providers across 2 different mediums. And the reason why I say that is if a coax cable gets cut, no matter who you're using as your vendor, you're not going to have internet. If you're using Comcast or MediaCom, and somebody outside takes a pair of, they're not scissors, but take a pair of scissors, and they cut that cable, no matter who you're using, you're not going to have internet. And so you want to pick across 2 different mediums, whether that's cable, telephone, satellite, even some places can do infrared, or tower to tower or point to point, where they beam the internet connection to your building. These are all things that you can, by adding an extra service provider, you can improve redundancy. So if one provider goes down, the other one's still running. When you would set this up on your firewall, and so most newer firewalls or firewalls that are in use today are able to have 2 internet connections or more, and they do what's called either round robin or simply failover, when as soon as it sees that there's no more data being sent back from one provider, it flips to the other, all behind the scenes. So there is sometimes a momentary loss of connection. People's connections might dip. If you're downloading something, it might error out, but at least you are able to keep running. The other is power. Power is huge. We need power to run all of our equipment. And so what happens when the power goes down? Most libraries, or at least a lot of libraries, have generators in place because they act as a heating shelter or just a shelter in general with the American Red Cross. And one of the requirements are having a generator on site. However, having a generator doesn't necessarily mean your server equipment will continually stay on. And so you want to make sure you have battery backups, or UPS, uninterruptible power supplies, that if power goes down, your servers don't drop really quick as the generator warms up and kicks on. So the battery supplies will keep the power going. If you don't have a generator, you want to invest more money into those power supplies so you can gradually bring down those servers or switches and whatnot and shut them down. Because if they're running processes and all of a sudden, somebody unplugs the computer, something bad usually happens. Something gets corrupted, data gets lost, data becomes missing. So utilizing these battery backups can help mitigate that risk of data loss or corruption. In choosing a battery backup, you can't just go to Staples and pick one off the shelf. There's a lot of math and decision planning involved. The first is to determine how much power your units or your rack or whatnot is consuming. How much energy does it need to stay on? So you'll get a voltage or a wattage, and you'll use that to determine what type of UPS to buy. You can sometimes buy inside your if you have a server rack, you can sometimes buy a power strip that has a meter already built in that shows power running through all the devices. And so you can monitor that over a period of time, just check throughout the day. If they're network-based, you can actually log in and monitor that. The next piece is your load time. So how much energy does this battery backup have based on the wattage? So if your servers are obviously using more wattage, the amount of time that battery can stay running decreases. So you want to make sure you have enough battery juice, if you will, to ensure your servers can run long enough for either A, to switch over to the generator, or B, so you can log in and shut everything down. And the last piece is finding a battery backup with the features you need. It usually doesn't cost that much more money when we're talking about backups overall, or battery-powered units overall, to have one that has a network connection. Most of them today do. You don't need to skimp out and not buy one with the internet connection or the ability to send alerts. It's very, very important to have that, so then you can monitor remotely, or you get email alerts or text alerts if something is going down, or if power goes out, then you know, hey, power's down, I have to start doing my job and shutting servers down, or have the IT person shut servers down, because we're not going to be able to stay up much longer. Conversely, you can make sure that you're not going over your allotted wattage. If a server starts zapping out more power, you can actually detect that in real time and then make adjustments accordingly. So if you're like, hey, all of a sudden my peak usage on this UPS just skyrocketed, what's going on these servers? And you can actually use that to determine server problems. Overall, so switching gears, so we talked about services, now we're talking about our data. Data is very, very expensive. especially if we talk about like if we're storing financial records. Sarbanes-Oxley says that you have to keep your financial records for 7 years. So if we have a server that goes down and we get audited, or somebody wants to know about our finances and we can't show it to them, there's not many very good consequences out of those conversations. In terms of what a data record costs, the cost of a data record being stolen from a healthcare, they say it's $363. If we talk about like our HR employee information, it's fairly similar, where if that data gets lost or somebody steals it, you have to kind of do stuff to make sure their identity doesn't get stolen. There's a group called the Fonneman Institute that did a cost of data breach study, where they said that the average record with confidential or sensitive information was $154. So if you had employee files that got stolen, it can range between $154 and $363, which is expensive. And then Verizon does a cost per record perspective. So meaning like if you had a database that had multiple lines, each line or each piece of paper or whatnot would cost 58 cents, which is over time can add up. The most obvious way to attack somebody, if you're thinking like a hacker, is to walk into a building, sit down on an unlocked computer, and wreak havoc. And that's the easiest way, and it's probably one of our biggest holes. So making sure people simply lock their computers can help mitigate some of that risk. But overall, what can happen to our data? Our data can be corrupted, and that can be on purpose, where someone makes a change to a file, either on accident or on purpose. It saves and goes, oops, I didn't mean to do that. A lot of us, that's why the undo button is so magical in Word. But on server end or on scripting ends, if you run a script, you can't necessarily undo that. You have to run the commands to undo what you did. And so in turn, if your data is corrupted or you manipulate or you do a bad update, you can impact your system performance as well. Things might not run as smoothly as they used to. If corrupted is one problem, losing the data altogether is an even bigger problem. So if a server goes down, somebody just pulls it out of the rack and walks home with it. That's all of your data is gone. And that includes your spreadsheets, employee files, if you make flyers, if you do recording on events, if you have grant applications, all of that work you've ever done in your library can disappear. And you have to know that that's a very, very possible event. Thinking something's not going to happen to you because you're a library isn't really fair, because it can happen to anybody. Website data, catalog data, hosted applications, all that could be gone if you're hosting it on a server that you own. Or at the same time, if it's hosted somewhere else, you still want to worry what happens if that server goes down. So I'll share a quick story. I use Bluehost for my website hosting, and I build websites for other people. One of my clients, their Bluehost server went down. They sent an email saying, hey, our servers went down, we're doing a recovery, we have it backed up, don't worry. So I was like, all right, cool. Turns out that the backup they did for the website I built was corrupted, and therefore it wasn't their problem, it was mine, because I should have made my own backups. And it's clearly listed that they're not really ultimately responsible for data loss. It's me as the user that's responsible for data loss. And so I wasn't very happy, because all my data that I worked on disappeared, and it was, well, my fault because I didn't plan. So make sure that if you're hosting your website somewhere else, you make sure that you back up the data yourself. Ask if you can get copies sent, if you can download the database, whatever it is, and store those somewhere, because sometimes those providers aren't going to be responsible if something happens, and you're going to be kind of fish out of water with it. And the last piece is hardware failure. Hardware can just fail and you can lose your data. Now there's companies out there that can take a failed drive and extract data from it. Sometimes it's cheap, like a couple $100. Sometimes it's a few thousands. And so it all depends on how much, if that's a risk you're willing to not worry about and just pay for it if it breaks. Keep that in mind, that there's recovery options out there, but depending on the extent of damage, it can cost a lot. There's multiple ways to back up. So if we're talking about an entire system, there's full backup, incremental, differential, and mirror. A full backup is basically taking a snapshot of the entire computer, operating system, log files, files that are on there, files that are created, Active Directory, email, whatever it might be, and copy all of it. It takes a forever time to do because it literally has to copy each file. Restore time is pretty fast, but it takes up a lot of space because we're literally copying a server verbatim. The other options are incremental. So as we add or subtract files, it will track that. And so you can actually set up an incremental backup to not look at system files and look at like Word, PowerPoint type files instead, or database files. Then there's differential backups. So last time you did a full backup, it can copy that data and back up. Or the mirror is basically just doing an exact copy. As you add one file in one place, it copies it somewhere else in real time. So if we're putting up a calendar, so when we're talking about backups to protect our data, you want to do multiple types of backups at scheduled intervals. So my recommendation is every month do a full backup. Do a full backup of every single server, of every single device. Copies everything. Then do a hourly or daily incremental backups. So throughout the day, as you add files, back those up. And either schedule it once an hour or every day, depending on how much data you generate. If you make only a couple entries a day onto your computers, it's probably not important to do hourly because you can recover that just by redoing it. But if you are a huge library, you have a huge amount of data being created, you want to increase those intervals. And then weekly differentials. So every week, do a differential backup. So copy everything that's been created since the last full backup. And the reason why we do 3 different types is, let's say something occurs on a Monday and it impacts our data, and we don't notice it until Friday. Luckily, we have our hourly and daily backups to fix that. We can look at the previous week. At the same time, weekly differentials don't get updated as data gets updated. So let's say a virus hits our system and locks all of our files. Well, we can just grab the last week's backup and recover. Monthly full backups are like your Hail Mary. So if none of those backups worked, you should have a really good working full backup from the beginning of the month that you can pull from. At the same time, you want to also take these backups and store them off-site. And the reason is, what happens if something happens to your building, it burns down, and you had a stack of backup drives in your closet that are now ruined? All of your backup efforts have been wasted. And so take those backups to, there's actual companies that you can pay to, it's almost like a storage locker, where they'll store your drives in like a heat-safe, fire-safe, everything-safe unit, electrostatic, all of that jazz, or just like bring them home, put them on a shelf somewhere. If you have multiple buildings, rotate those backups across the different buildings, and that's a cheap way to store off-site. There's lots of different backup mediums that are available to you. External drives, so plugging in a drive. NAS, which are network area storage units, so backing up data across the network to a set of drives. Using tape drives or using clouds. They all have different pros and cons. I really like the network storage options, where data is sent across the network, because then you can monitor that remotely. You don't have to go computer to computer. It's harder for that to be stolen. So if I see an external drive lying out, I can walk up to it and unplug it. If it's on a NAS, usually that's locked in a security cabinet with all your other IT equipment. And also usually there's more encryption involved on the NAS end, so somebody can't necessarily walk up to your network storage and zip out a hard drive, because it's usually encrypted and they're not going to be able to do anything with the data. Tape drives is still, I also like tape drives if you are into that. It takes a little bit more work and they're expensive, but you can keep a tape drive for years and your data will be fine for the most part. Whereas hard drives and stuff can actually fail over time. They can fail if they're not in use. Tapes will, they say they're like the cockroaches of backups, because you can have them forever. If we're talking about external hard drives or drives within a network storage unit, buying solid-state drives is a heck of a lot more expensive, but it decreases the risk of hardware failure because there's no moving parts. There's nothing in there that's spinning that can break or crack. Solid-state drive is almost like a flash drive. We're talking about server end, so we can do backups And we can also do RAIDs on a server. And so what a RAID is, how would you copy your data across multiple drives? Most NASs, network storage units, are set up as RAIDs, so the data is copied across. I'm not going to dig into all of these. The one that I utilize the most is RAID 5 because it copies data redundantly across multiple disks. And so it allows me to, if one drive fails, I'm okay. And so I actually have a NAS at my house where I have, I don't know, like 2,000 movies and almost like 20,000 different TV shows, or episodes rather. And so I want to make sure I don't lose any of that data. So I have a couple NASs going on, so if an entire NAS fails, I still have another one running. It's paranoia. Once you get burned enough times, you are willing to invest as much money as possible to protect your data. So in terms of devices, there's Western Digital makes a whole suite of really nice backup NASs. They're called MyClouds. The more professional enterprise version is the EXEC series, where you have 4 bays, and they can do RAID 5, RAID 6, and copy data across. You can access it across the network. You can access files on your cell phone. You can actually run like a WordPress site and stuff off of it, which is pretty cool. A little bit more higher end is the QNAP. You can actually run like Drupal servers off of these and run like Windows OSs apparently, which is kind of neat. But it's a robust device and you pay for it. With the QNAP though, it's also kind of neat because you can put in solid state drives and back up to those as well. And that's 16 bays, so that's 16 drives you can replicate data across. One of my favorites, so I used to work in a library, and we actually went with Unitrends for a backup solution because it was scalable. So what Unitrends does is it's able to do a bare metal disk. And so what it'll scan the network, find all your servers, and actually copy your entire server to a CD. So you can boot from it essentially. So if your server goes down, you pop in a CD. It uses its hard drive then as well to replicate the data, but uses a CD to talk to it. And so you can recover an entire server, entire operating system, all the configurations, everything through this device. It's phenomenally cool. And then there's a device that you can actually drop in new hard drives into and pull them out to take them home or to do rotating backups. The calendar feature is fantastic. So highly recommended, beautiful product, and saved me millions of times. When we're talking about software, SYMANTEC Backup Exec is probably the most popular. It can also do the tape drives and detect slot mediums and monitor rotations if you have a huge tape drive with multiple drive support. It's a fantastic tool. ACRONIS Backup is another one. What's neat about ACRONIS is now you can actually sync your backups to the cloud, so you don't have to actually have a physical storage device. It will do an entire system image and send it off on the internet. So if we're talking about data backups and copying data other places, the other tool to use is called replication. We're essentially going to take an entire server and replicate it to somewhere else. This works really well for redundancy. So if a site goes down, we're still able to operate by utilizing the other site that copied all the data over, either in real time or it could be a couple hour delay. However, it's not the best for protecting our data. So if for instance, CryptoLocker, which is a virus that can lock all of your files, we have to pay like a ransom to get access to your files again. If that occurred on your network, it would replicate, obviously, to your replication server, which is the exact same stuff as the server you're at now, and you defeated the whole purpose of your redundancy because it will attack both ends. So, and there's different ways to replicate. The preferred method is to replicate to an entirely different set of hardware, meaning, which is important because if our hardware fails on one setup, it's still working on the other. Or you can use VMs, so multiple virtual machines, where it would copy to a different virtual machine. So if that one actually had a software glitch or an error, you might be able to recover it from the replication side. This is essentially sort of what the VMware server will look like if you're doing replications. very, very simple. So VMware is probably the powerhouse in terms of replications. It does a phenomenal job managing all that for you. When we're talking about replicating somewhere else, Google Cloud has a phenomenal product that you can actually replicate to their cloud servers. Basically, it's like only a couple lines of code you would add into your Linux environment if you're running Linux, for instance. And it'll say, hey, as soon as these servers boot up, just copy the data. Copy that data all day long. And as your servers go down, you would then essentially point your domain servers to Google Cloud. And they have it all listed out on how to do that. And so you can have a lot of real-time replication. I put the link if you wanted to take a look at it. Show the SQL one. Amazon also does the same thing, where you can replicate across their networks. But I want to share a story that also is important about replication. So if we're hosting on Amazon or Google, if you ever log in, you can actually get like free credits with Google so you can play around with it. If you've never done it, I would encourage you just to tinker. But essentially, you would build servers in regions. And the reason why there's different regions, so if a region goes down, the other region will still work. They're connected with each other, but also independent, if that makes sense. So Amazon actually, a couple days ago, had a huge outage. The outage was so huge, in fact, that their dashboard, to let you know if things were up or down, utilized one of the region that was down to work. And so it was funny because people were making jokes about it on Twitter that the error icon was hosted on it was the E3, so region 3. The icon for something's down was hosted on the system that's actually down. So it couldn't show people it was down. It was kind of humorous. What happened was human error. Someone was doing a command to make billing better, miskeyed something, and brought everything down. So when you're talking about letting people manage your data, keep in mind other people are managing your data, meaning you're entrusting somebody else not to make a mistake. And so keep that in mind if you're hosting completely independent or with somebody else and they're managing all your data for you. Keep in mind that user error occurs. So other places you can host your data. There's a couple of data centers. One in Chicago is called Backspace, and one over in Aurora, I believe they're in Aurora, is Lattices. They have a gigantic data center with security, top-notch. You have to be keyed in. You're actually not allowed to take pictures of their environment, so people can't look up model numbers to hack. So they do a phenomenal job managing that data. But at the same time, if we're connecting to that with like an internet connection, and that internet connection goes down, we won't be able to get to our data anyway. So these are things you have to consider. And so lots of different options, lots of different ways to manage your risk, but at the same time, as we push risk to somebody else, there's different kinds of risks that occur. So if I'm pushing my risk of someone going to my building and burning my servers, and I'm giving it to Lattices to host, then I have a different set of risks. Can I trust those Lattices users with my data? What happens if they're not trusty? We'll talk about application hosting really quick. There's a front end and a back end. Most people don't replicate databases because it's hard to copy data from databases as they're running. So usually people replicate their front ends. So that's like your actual server. And then the back ends, which is the database, usually just gets backed up. Because most applications can't look at two different databases while they're running. So if you do a replicated database, you have to log into your server to say, hey, this database is down, here's the new one, and then things will come back to normal. The other concept with disaster recovery and risk mitigation is having high availability. And there's three main types. There's a hot site, where there's a location that's constantly running. So if you have multiple buildings, you would have a hot site, two different buildings, and you can replicate your data between both of them. So data being generated at facility A, you can copy to facility B. And that's actually incredibly cheap since you own both sites. It's not as expensive as it was hosting somewhere else because you already own the building. A warm site, it's periodical synchronization. So every now and then, once a week, once a day, once a month, it'll copy data to another site. So you power it up, copy your data, power it down. cold site, where it's basically just extra. You can either do a cold site in the same building or have extra devices off to the side. So if something happens, you would plug it all in, boot it all up, set something up temporarily to keep you running. So we talked a lot about scary stuff, so let's talk about less scary stuff. Monitoring. There are a ton of tools out there that do a phenomenal job monitoring your infrastructure. Monitoring everything from network drops to process loads to the temperature of your devices, how much memory is being used, if there's an error in a database, to be alerted. Which is so, and in terms of database, if you're not from the IT background, almost everything we use today has a database end. Your websites, if they're managed through a content management system, have a database backend. And so if anything happens to that database in any way that corrupts your data, it's not going to happen. It's not a happy time because things are queried, things are pulled. Most accounting software is database driven. So we want to make sure that if someone runs a report that keeps erroring out, that's sending bad data to our database, we can detect it. So lots of different tools that can manage and track what's going on. So here's an example of somebody's homegrown monitoring that shows all the alerts. You would click on the little triangles to find out what the alert is or what the warning is, and if there's errors, what the error is, and fix them. And the idea is when you wake up and you look at your dashboard, everything should be green checkbox. Nagios is probably the most well-known tool. It takes a little bit of setup time and configuration to make work. It's not something you can just install and it just works out of the box. So you have to show it what to watch and what to monitor. But then you can get really cool reports emailed to you if something goes down, if the server gets overheated, that list I showed earlier. Really great tool. And so you can have an email all the IT folks. You can have an email your outsourced IT vendors, whatever it may be. PINGDOM is another great tool that will actually, so ping is basically reaching out saying, hey, are you there? You get a response, yes, things are good. So PINGDOM actually is the product of that, where it will ping all of your servers, ping all of your outbound devices if you wanted, so all of your websites, and it'll tell you if things are up or down. If it's seeing that there's a lot of network drops, it'll let you know. You can also ping your internal devices, so you can say, hey, I want you to make sure this switch that I have constantly works, and if you see it drop a packet, I want to know right away so I can look into it. But they have a really great dashboard that can track and manage all of your data. As I stated earlier, testing our plan is incredibly important. How do you test? So if we're talking about recovery, run your recovery process. Say, hey, we have these backups. Let's see if we can rebuild our entire infrastructure. Let's go. So throw up a new VM, copy all your data, see how long it takes. Then you would put that in your disaster plan. If our servers go down, it takes us 45 minutes to recover our data. So now you have timelines. So then you can tell people when it's down, you can say how long it'll take to be back up. If you're talking about redundancy, if we have redundant networks, unplug one of your internet connections, see if your firewall can kick over, see what gets lost. If we're talking about multiple firewalls or switches, unplug one, see what happens, see if your network can reroute traffic. You would monitor your network as you do it to find out where things are being traced. So you would do like trace routes and find out the path a device takes to get to another device. And so remove one of those devices and see if it can reroute appropriately. And you keep doing these tests. A good disaster plan would have monthly tests or quarterly tests where you have to pretend like you had a full system failure and rebuild everything. And there's two differences we should talk about. We're talking about disaster planning. Is emergency response. So what do we do immediately if something occurs? Who do we call? What do we do? Then there's the business side of it, where what do we do in terms of our business? So how can we keep the library running still, short-term and long-term? So internet down, not the end of the world, because if your servers are still there, you can still run. So is there a short-term fix? Can we call another internet provider, have them run us a connection really fast? while we make our disaster plan, the idea is we want to mitigate as many risks as possible and then plan really well for those risks we can't mitigate or we can't avoid. The disaster plan has multiple tiers where overall we have to do a lot of research and gathering and question sheets. I'll show an example in a second. Analyzing those results and then building strategies to protect those results. So I showed you today some of the things that you would probably uncover during your investigation. So our internet, our data, our servers. How do we develop policies and protect against it? How do we make sure that we are able to move forward if something goes down? And then exercise training, and that technically should be testing. And the last piece is auditing. So every now and then, audit and make sure that things are working correctly. Sean mentions that his initial thought on this slide was, yes, disaster plans do have multiple tiers. That's funny. Yep, it's a painstaking process, and it's something that takes, if you've never built one, it takes a couple months to do, because you have to survey, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, you have to survey business owners and say, hey, you're the owner of this server, tell me everything about it, all the risks that are associated, and you make them fill out a form, and the forms aren't fun. So to recap, overall, we want to assess our risks and what risks there are and how to handle them. You can utilize that risk matrix to determine how much effort is needed. Then you need to put plans in place if there is some sort of failure or if those risks become true. What makes the most sense to you? Who are those people that you contact to bring together? And again, test. Make sure that we can validate, make sure that our risk mitigation or disaster recovery works. So there's a link, and I think you guys be able to see it. That shows an example of a disaster plan. There you go. So it's a template, and I put the link in the PowerPoint slides that will be shared with you. And feel free to interrupt if you have questions. But overall, it's their template is how many pages? So this is a template when nothing's filled out. It's 33 pages alone, where you put your policy, work contacts. This is your calling tree. So if this person is available, who's the next person based off a department? Your key business processes, finance, HR, what triggers this document to be in a place? Who's the emergency contacts? Where's the good stuff? So you would give this template to people. So what is your system? What does it do? What are the requirements for it? Who owns it? What are the vendors? What do we do if this happens? And this list should probably be updated. So lots of data, lots of hardware, corrupted data, data breach. So someone breaches into our system, we need to determine what to do, which isn't on here. So whoever wants to make $1 million can probably build an update. So I'll let you guys go through that slide, through those multiple pages on your own. Yeah, that document is, if I didn't build a document, it's probably the most widely discussed template on the internet. The link is here. It's somebody hosted it off of OneDrive. So some stories to scare you and make you want to build your disaster plan. And this might sound bad since I knew each of these or I was associated in some way, but I'll take no responsibility. So there was a business that actually went to halt for 3 days because somebody had the CryptoLocker virus, which replicates across the network. So what a CryptoLocker virus is a worm that will look for a network drives and then copies itself across all those folders. And so as it copies, if it'll see another file, if you don't have your file permissions set correctly, it makes it really bad because it zips through it super fast. But what ended up happening was the CryptoLocker got onto the email server, and when people were sending emails, it pushed out even more, and it was a huge mess. And so for 3 days, they had no systems. They had to turn everything down and recover from backups. Email is a brutally slow process in recovering because of the amount of data. Email servers are usually huge because no one likes deleting stuff. There's another business that had I used to work for them. They actually called me because their accounting server The individual that was supposed to continue backing up didn't, and it was right before tax season. And so they were in a huge rush where they had to hire a whole bunch of extra people to do all the accounting for the entire year because the accounting server failed. There was an error on it and it crashed out, and it was a VM. And so for recovery on a VM with a hardware vendor makes it really difficult. And then a SAN failure. Somebody had an EMC array set up, so by default, this should have been a no problem issue because data is copied across multiple drives, except it wasn't alerting people that the drives were failed, nor was anyone monitoring it. So there was 5 drives that died, and on the 6th drive, because the array was set up in such a way, you could have up to 6 hardware failures with no business impact. The 6th drive failed, and then since it's SAN, so all the devices on the network, all the servers have hard drive space off of it, everything went down. And asked, any suggestions for web host backup and failover? So I guess my follow-up question is, are you hosting the data or somebody else hosting the data? What I would do, in any scenario, is to download that to, usually you can store it on a flash drive if it's just a website. So somebody else is hosting the data. So you can actually have them email you, depending on the vendor, you can either log in and you would download what's called it's probably on MySQL or yeah, probably on MySQL. So download that. It's a database file. Depending on who's hosting it, you're able to either log in and download what's called the entire cPanel. So you can download everything that's on there and all the configurations, all the settings, and save that to your network, or save it to a flash drive and rotate those flash drives. The alternative is to reach out and ask them, hey, I want to get localized copies of our website and our database that's associated with it once a week, and put the responsibility on them to engineer a solution. It depends on the vendor. Mary asks, is web-based email a bit of a safeguard against a crypto-locker type situation? Yes and no. So if we're using Microsoft, for instance, I would expect them to have enough security in place to prevent that spam filtering, etc. But so if I send somebody an email and I'm on my physical computer and I have the CryptoLocker virus on it and I open it up, now I brought that CryptoLocker virus onto my internal network and I can still spread it. And so it depends on how we're looking at this CryptoLocker thing, and how we're talking about if our email is going to be affected. Probably not, because our cloud vendor should be okay, but our internal network not so much. So it's usually overall though it's usually fairly safe. Microsoft probably won't get hit by a CryptoLocker virus, and if they did, depending on what the ransom would be, I think they would pay for it just because they don't want that bad publicity, because that could basically ruin Microsoft. So for redundancy for switchover. So personally, and maybe that's because I'm biased, I've been using Google Cloud lately for probably like the last 2 months, and I think it's like the greatest setup ever. So what you could do is you can, I wonder if there's a tool. You would probably need the files and stuff from whoever's hosting your site, and copy that data over. Does that make sense? So Google Cloud can basically, you would copy that data, build your own server on Google Cloud, and then you have to also own the domains. So it's multi-tiered. Do I have time to show? Yeah. Here, I'll actually. If you have questions, here's my contact info. So Sean points out, so at the very least, we should be incorporating what vendors have for disaster recovery for those servers and databases we do not host. Absolutely. So we need to determine what their recovery process is, if they have redundancy, and what they plan on doing if something happens. And then especially for a library with limited IT on site, which has multiple vendor solutions over in-house, except for mission critical devices. So yeah, 100% correct, Sean. Because if we overlook what our vendors are doing, or if they're not doing their job, like in my instance with Bluehost, they weren't doing their job with backups correctly, it was ultimately my fault and my responsibility. So, and I'll just really show you this quick. And so I'm playing with like free credit and stuff. It's kind of cool. So you build your servers here, and they're very simple to do and very simple to set up. Then your vendor might be actually able to help you with that. The next piece is you have to also own the domains. So, oops, that's not what I wanted. So if you own the domains with Google Cloud, you're able to set up what's called Cloud DNS. So I own this domain, and at any point, if this server goes down, I have two of them, I can then edit this IP address that points to that actual server to my backup server, and no one notices it, which is beautiful. I'll just put in the new IP, nothing else changes. So it's two parts when we're talking about website hosting. If the server goes down, we have to have another server in place with a different address, and we have to then update our domain to make sure that the world knows that there's a different server it should be looking at. Does that make sense? And then if there's any other questions or even you want to ask after the fact, feel free. Or if you want to geek out with me and talk like about Google Cloud and stuff, feel free as well, because it's actually, and you get $300 credit initially to play with. So like create an account, just play around. Even if you're not in IT, it walks you through some really well laid out like how to set up a server and stuff. So there's a learning opportunity if you never set up a server as well, and how to set up a web page, which I thought was well done. Are there any other questions? So Mary asked, WordPress website hosting, we're currently using a local company called A5, but considered moving. I haven't heard of A5. Then again, it doesn't mean it's a bad thing. So if you're worried about loss in data, ask A5, do you replicate? So use some of the words I showed today. Do you replicate your data? So, and then if they're like, what does that mean? Well, probably not. I wouldn't use the company. If they say, yeah, ask them how. Do you copy this data from one server to an entirely different server? Do you have two different sites? So if one site goes down, are we going to be impacted? And so overall, I would ask them kind of some of the stuff we covered today and what their plans are. And if they don't jive with you, and if you don't feel confident that they can guarantee, again, you can't guarantee, but if they can't show that they're going to try to keep your data up as best as possible, then I would find a different vendor. Okay, so Mary talks about having a denial of service attack, and those are rough. The quick solution, if you ever have one of those hitting your website, is to use what's called Cloudflare. Even though they had the Heartbleed thing, so Cloudflare was leaking data about other people. There's this one, and then the other one is Intelligent. No, it's not. There's another company that's like Cloudflare that will actually, what you do is you would route all the traffic to their servers. So you say, hey everyone, don't access my server anymore, access Cloudflare for this instance. And what Cloudflare do will then block all those attacks and then reroute all the good data back to your site. And it's it takes like 30 minutes to set up. So we'll check that out. Yep, Andy, go ahead and email me about, I can send you the link to like how to sign up and stuff and to get the $300 credits.
Well, thank you, Brian. I I don't see any more questions at the moment. We still have a couple more minutes if anyone wants to type any last thoughts. But thanks, Brian. I really appreciate your presentation in this entire series. As you know, Rails has so many different types of libraries with varying staff levels. Some have IT professionals on staff, some contract out, some, it's one person who doesn't have an IT background. It's their job. So I think having this overview, I hope, was really helpful. I found it very helpful and fascinating to hear about these different things. And that template you shared, that's going to be invaluable. So I didn't know something like that existed, and that's so helpful to have something like that in place. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in, so thank you, Brian, for letting us record today and recording the entire series. I appreciate that, and I'll process that video and get it posted on our Rails website in a few days. Excellent. And with that, I thank you, everybody, for joining us for the series, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, Brian.
Bye-bye.
Bye.